Thanks. Well, good afternoon. I get the inevitable task of following up lunch, so I'm going to try to keep you guys awake. And I thought the best way to do that is, rather than having me stand up here and lecture you guys on how to do a valuation or an ESOP valuation, we'd actually spend some time going through an actual transaction and looking at what is the role of the various parties in the transaction. And we're going to focus on the sell-side advisor as opposed to the trustee advisor, because in most situations I think that's the role you guys would probably be playing, rather than working on behalf of the trustee. But maybe, I mean, we'll talk about both, but we're going to focus more on the sell-side advisory. So how many of you actually spent the time to listen to the webinar that we did last fall? Anybody in the room?
I just learned about it today, so I'll have to go back and
Okay.
About 20 minutes ago.
Okay. So without having the benefit of that, how many are business appraisers? Just about the whole room. How many do ESOP appraisals? A couple of, okay. So you guys are going to come up here and help me present them, or you'll correct all my misstatements. So a little bit about Aclaro. It was Best Business Appraisals. We started in 1999. 0 clients at that point in time. We bought a couple firms, merged some firms in. We now do about 150 annual ESOP valuations every year. We're involved in anywhere from, on a down year, we probably do 10 transactions. On last year, we did close to 30 transactions. We have 5 partners now, and a total staff of about 11, including nine professionals, so 4 analysts. Like I said, we do, ESOPs account for about 90% of our firm revenue. Would I say 90%? I meant 80%. And the balance of that is the state and gift tax and the typical stuff that everybody does. Divorce and all that type of things. And most of the divorce in that is me. Most of my other guys are 100% ESOP. So, like I said, we're going to focus on, I got to get my notes out to make this more effective. We're going to focus on a transaction. How many have done a transaction where they've acted as an advisor to the trustee, or to the seller?
Trustee.
Okay. Anybody else act in that role? So you are going to be my co-presenter.
My fees are very reasonable.
Okay. So this is actually an actual transaction that I did last year, but it is the culmination of a 3-year process, or actually about a 4-year process with the company. The subject of this valuation is it is an engineering firm in the Upper Midwest, about 100 employees, 18 owners though, which created a challenge. And they're a typical, run-of-the-mill engineering firm, growing a little faster than the industry is. They've got a couple of specialized lines that are doing very well. But the 2 founders founded the company. Well, it's in the material. I don't remember the year they founded, but they were both approaching retirement age, and they approached me and said, we want a valuation for the buy-sell agreement. So we did that valuation, and one of the original founders sold his shares based on that. And as we started going along, the second one wanted to finally retire, and he said, I just threw out have you guys considered an ESOP? And they'd never looked at an ESOP. So then that started the process of a 3-year education process and getting them to the point where they finally ended up selling to the ESOP in a very successful transaction. But for those of you that haven't been involved in a transaction, it's the same as it's similar to a normal transaction, any other M&A transaction. You're going to have somebody representing, usually an advisor or a consultant representing the selling shareholders. And you're going to have, in this case, rather than having another company or party, you have a trustee that is assigned, and he's responsible for the trust that's going to buy the shares, and on behalf of the employees. The difference is there's where some M&A transactions can get a little confrontational, let's say. These parties are more friendly towards each other because they're really, in many ways, they're going to have to live with one another after the transaction. So even though everybody's doing everything in accordance with standards and trying to maximize values in that, it's a little more friendly of a transaction. That doesn't mean that it's not, there's not conflict along the ways, but it's a little more friendly conflict, if that makes sense. So let's see, sell-side advisor, like I said, I called this, he didn't get it on the slides, but it was called the anatomy of an ESOP transaction. So the sell-side advisor is usually the first professional advisor in the deal, usually referred in though by the CPA or the attorney for the company. In this case, the selling shareholder had heard me speak at a conference, and that was our rig. So that's how I got involved in this. Now the initial work before we could do anything was you need to do evaluation, and obviously, but you're not doing evaluation as a sell-side advisor. You're not doing the formal valuation report that's fully compliant with ISBA. In fact, your due diligence and everything doesn't have to comply with ISBA. It's a good idea if it does, but you're not going to be issuing a valuation report as a result of your work if you're the sell-side advisor. So you've got a little more flexibility there. But you still want to go through that similar process. And typically the first step that's involved after you learn about the company and its industry and do all the background due diligence on that is the preparation of the forecasted financial statements. Because the forecasted financial statements are going to be very critical in the process. So when you look at this company, what we did with them is they had never done a forecast before in their lives, which, I mean, for a company that size, I thought was kind of unusual. They weren't even doing budgeting. They were just kind of flying by the seat of their pants, and somehow they'd been successful every year. So we had them start with number of employees and what are their billable hours per employees, what's the realization rate, just like you would do a value or a forecast for a professional service firm. And we had them, and they'd never looked at any of that stuff before. So it was having them go back and look up, well, what are the billable hours historically? What is your realization rate? What is your utilization rate? All those terms were unfamiliar with them. So we had them spend quite a bit of time getting the basic data in order to build up the forecast. But then we put together a very detailed forecast, which in the end, I mean, it was you could debate whether it was aggressive or not, but we showed some pretty good growth in there, and we ended up, well, I'll tell that story later about how we ended up working with the trustees advisor and how we went out 5 years in this case, yeah. And even if you think your company traditionally you would just use a capitalization of earnings method, because a capitalization of earnings method is just a shortcut DCF, right? I mean, it's just got it's got two simplifying assumptions: a representative level of earnings and a constant growth rate. Even if you have that, you still need to take the time and put together the forecast. Because one of the things, how many of you are familiar with Rob Slee? Okay, a few people in the room. Well, if you remember Rob's seminal book on private capital markets, one of the things that he talks about in there is the importance of, or the role of the authority in the value world, as he calls it. And in the ESOP value world, who's the authority? well, the DOL is the ultimate authority, but if you're doing this type of work, ultimately the party that's going to make or break the call is the trustee. So, and the trustee is going to hire that advisor, financial advisor, and he's going to want to be the one looking at your forecast, and whether it is with the emphasis of the DOL right now on the appropriateness of the forecast, you need to make sure that you can support it. So we went right down to the very lowest inputs, and they spent 6 months putting this forecast together. But we've got very little pushback from the trustee's advisor. He basically, even though it was aggressive, he said this is aggressive, but he said it's well supported, and you know, we'll see if you can do it or not, but we're going to accept it. So, but that's the first part, is well, before that we spent a lot of time analyzing what had happened historically, as I talked about, getting all the data, you know, because we had to have that basic understanding of what had happened historically. Well, one of the things we found when we looked at the historical operations was, even though this company wasn't an ESOP, they acted as if they were an ESOP. They were very employee-centric. They would, for instance, when you looked at the compensation that they were paying to their non-stockholders, it was way above industry average. When you looked at their base salaries, it was at industry average. When you looked at the bonuses, it was 3 to 4 times the level that, in certain years, let me actually clarify that. In when they had really good years, they paid out huge bonuses to the non-stockholder employees, and when they had bad years, those bonuses they were much smaller. And we were able to convince, and I think rightfully so, that we actually treated that as a return on investment as opposed to a return on labor. And well, and that's obviously a concern that we had to address. So we had numerous employee meetings, and explained to them they're now owners, and they're what we were paying to them as a return on, you know, as bonuses. They're now going to receive the benefit of that, but they're going to have to assume some risk. Yeah, we had well, I had 2 in-person meetings with the employee groups, and I know management had many more meetings, because obviously that was the concern. But one of the things to understand is that even at the level that we ultimately set the bonuses at, that we adjusted down to, we were still above market. We had set our bonuses, rather than paying out 4 times, we were about almost 2 times industry bonus levels. So there was, you know, because the concern was, well, these employees are just going to leave. Well, where are they going? They're not going to go. They're not going to leave for money, because they can't go elsewhere and make that kind of money. So, I mean, we're only a few months into the deal, but they haven't had anybody leave yet. Now, that doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but everybody's comp's been adjusted to the new levels in that, so we think we're pretty safe there. But you know, understanding what was going on historically in those financial statements was pretty important too. We had set the shareholder bonuses at, we set the non-shareholder bonuses at roughly 2 times industry average. We set the shareholder bonuses at 20% higher than industry average. So we had some room in there. No, because they were doing it anyways. I mean, that's one of the things that employee stock ownership plans or companies that are owned by ESOPs are notorious for having open book management and very participative management styles in that. And this company was already doing that. They were already now they wouldn't share in the in-depth. I mean, they didn't get down to salary levels with everybody. They didn't get down to that level. The only thing they had is they had published ranges for people, and everybody knew what those published ranges were. So I mean, they were pretty open.
Everybody knows that there's gonna be a range that they're gonna fall into.
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, yeah, they had 4 levels of engineers, and if you were an engineer 4, your comp was going to range from X to Y, and same thing with an engineer 3, and it was all based on the time you'd been with the company and your skill set. So, but anyways, we did the forecast, did our due diligence, and in this case, we actually did issue a report. We issued a restricted valuation report that was strictly limited to the use of management and the ESOP exploratory committee in this case.
So who appoints that committee?
The shareholders did in this case. There was some non-shareholders that were very active in the process, and they were in effect what they ended up being was the representative of the rest of the employee group. So they kind of had a seat at the table in the whole process, saying, we're not real thrilled with this aspect of what you're doing, so they gave some input into that process. So that was the valuation. Now the next thing you have to deal with is the structuring of the transaction. And how many people in here do M&A? Okay, so you probably do more M&A than I do. Okay, so obviously you guys understand the structuring of the transaction, and we had to figure out what our senior debt capacity was. We did quite a bit of work on collateral analysis and cash flow multiples and those types of things to size out that loan. And then when we're still in the process of. We haven't made a decision on whether we're even going to do this yet. We're still trying to get the information and educate them as to whether we're going to do this. So we had to size it. First of all, what we ultimately ended up doing was going to the marketplace, or taking them to the marketplace, and soliciting bids for the financing. And we ended up getting. We went to 17 institutions. We got 5 bids back. We narrowed it down to 3. We played them off against each other, and we ended up getting a little bit more financing than we were expecting to get.
So what's a typical timeline? Obviously it varies.
Well, look, you can close an ESOP transaction. I've done them in a week. But
no, but I'm saying as far as the financing portion of it.
The financing portion took us about 2.5 months. So.
I apologize. So as far as, you had 3 takers, banks, that were interested.
Yeah,
So
well, one wasn't a bank, but.
Or whatever.
Yeah,
private
a
equity.
financing institution.
Yeah, financing. So in terms of the actual structure of financing that, I'm assuming there's a financing structure in there to pay this. I know nothing about this stuff, so.
Well, here's what we had. Here's the challenge that we faced in the financing. In an ESOP transaction, this is a C Corp. I forgot to mention that.
Oh, okay.
This is a C Corp here. This is not an S Corp. This was a C Corp. And in a C Corp ESOP, or a C Corp that's looking to sell to an C Corp, shareholders of a C Corp looking to sell to an ESOP can defer the gain on the sale by doing a 1042 election, where they defer the gain and they don't pay capital gains tax on it. Well, the founder that was remaining was certainly going to do 1042, and he held a large chunk of the stock. We also had other individuals that were going to do partial 1042s and tag along on the majority shareholders. And at one point, we looked at doing floating rate notes to get them the cash and leverage that position. We ended up not doing floating rate notes, but Actually, we did do floating rate notes for the senior guy because he didn't get all of his money out in cash. But the challenge here was we only had so much senior financing available, and we had to satisfy all our cash needs with that senior financing piece, because the rest of it was all going to be carried back as a seller note.
Yeah.
And so you know, it was a little. We knew how much we had available, and we had to end up negotiating, for lack of a better term, with all of the 18 shareholders on, and you know, because we got oversubscribed, or more of them wanted cash than wanted to carry back the paper, until I figured out what the paper was actually paying, and then it kind of flipped around. You know, it was a funny dynamic in the process, because we had all these people said, yeah, we'll sell for cash, and then once we were able to get through, you know, because this thing happens in steps with the trustee, and the first thing's got to fall before you can do the next thing. And so we finally got to the point where we were pricing the warrants, and when we got to that point, we struck a sweetheart deal for them, and then everybody said, well, I don't want to sell for cash anymore. I want my I want notes, and it's like,
So is it all or none?
no, we had a
A mix?
they could mix.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you normally don't see that, but we did it. I mean, this was a fairly complex transaction that we did, and I'll get into some of that. But so we did the collateral, we got the capital structure down, we considered the 1042 rollover. One of the things you also end up doing, and I'm going to show you that. Maybe I should show you this now. Well, let me just run through the rest of it. You need to do a post-transaction cash flow analysis. Obviously, now that you've got the structure in place and you've got the transaction terms in place, you need to start doing some post-transaction cash flow analysis to see if you can cash flow this thing post-transaction. And of course, that takes into, you know, we've got the bank now telling us that our debt service coverage ratio has to be, I couldn't believe we got 1.2. I don't know.
125.
1.25 is pretty common. They said 1.2, and we said, okay, 1.2. That gives us an extra little, you know, cash flow that we can do other things with. I mean, there's some other things that are amazing in the deal. We were actually able to make a distribution at closing for all of their. Anyways, we made about $1 million distribution at closing in addition to the purchase price that we weren't anticipating because of the way that. Yeah, well, it was pretty creative to get that, but we got it. You also have to run a 404K benefit analysis. That's how much can the company deduct as a retirement plan contribution. It has to be less than 25%. You have to run through that analysis. One thing that you don't often see done, but you have to do, or make sure you don't forget to do it, is a 415 analysis on the individual benefit levels. In this case, what ended up happening is we had 415 issues with some of the shareholders and employees because they had fully funded their 401ks, and part of it, and part of our transaction, the way we structured the transaction, and the way most ESOP transactions are structured today, is it's a redemption by the corporation of the shares, followed by a purchase of the remaining shares by the trust. And the reason that structure has become so popular is, that's okay. The Department of Labor is really focused on the transaction price and that, and if you've been following what's going on in the ESOP world, there's about 7 or 8 different process agreements with trustees all across the country, and most of that relates to the forecast and the pricing and that. So to get a way to take that out of the purview of the Department of Labor, they're doing it as a redemption transaction and then selling only a small piece of it. Well, in this case, we had, let me run through some of that when I get there, but anyways, we had to make sure you do the 415 analysis. And then the other thing I'm going to talk about now is you need to also look at one of the things that the the trustee group is really going to focus on is what is your benefit level post-transaction. They're going to target usually they try to set a target benefit level, and in our case, we had targeted 4% long-term benefit level for the employees, which was at the lower end of because they were also, in addition to the ESOP, they were continuing their 401k plan, and the 401k plan was making up about 3%. So they were targeting 7% total, but only 4% from the ESOP, and I'll show you how we got to that. But once you know that benefit level, you can then size the inside note. Everybody know what the inside note is? Okay, the company goes out typically. In a typical transaction, they'll go to a third-party lender and they'll get the money from a bank or a financing institution. That's the outside note. And then they take that cash, because they may not have the cash themselves currently, they take that cash and they lend it to the ESOP trust. And that loan between the trust and the company is called the inside note. And then that is, the interest rate really doesn't matter, but you set the interest rate at market rate. And then the term of that note is typically sized out or determined by what do you want your benefit level to be. And it's not this simple, but if you want a 5% benefit level, you do a 20-year note. It's not that simple, but it kind of is. But you're trying to determine what's that benefit level. And there's a lot of assumptions that go into determining the benefit level. What is the growth in the value of the company going forward? How many shares are being released? And the shares released is determined by the term of the note. Because for all intents and purposes, if you have a 20-year note, you're going to be releasing 5% of the shares every year. And 5% of the shares, depending on what your benefit or what your compensation is doing versus the value of those shares, you can figure out the relationship. And I'm gonna get to that here in a little bit. You also have to run the warrant analysis. In this case, we had seller financing for the portion of the purchase price that we weren't able to get third-party financing for, and so that had to be carried back by the shareholders. And one of the things there you can look at, there's a number of different sources to look at, but the one we use is by GF Data. Anybody use GF Data? They actually have a transaction report that they do, I think it's quarterly, that they go to the mid-market and they give you the statistics as to what the pricing multiples are. But what is really helpful in that report is they get more in depth, and they'll talk about debt service coverage ratios. But the key thing here is they talk about on mezzanine debt, what is the cost of that debt. So they'll give you a benchmark that you can go to.
The total capital structure can be evaluated in terms of cost of capital.
Yes, it can.
So this is a silly question. So if there's a 20-year note, let's say that I'm an employee, I'm not a stockholder. Obviously, the banks are going to want some kind of security.
Yeah.
So the question is, where does that security come from, and who's responsible for that security?
The note is usually with the company, and they'll take a security interest in the company's assets.
So
no personal guarantees.
Okay. All right.
No. Or there weren't in any of the deals I've done, no personal guarantees. So, but after you get all this, you're doing all this analysis before you've even engaged the trustee. I mean, you got to do it all up front. You got to basically, here's what the deal's going to look like. Here's all our analysis. It's going to work. Now we got to go find a trustee. So you find the trustee, and he'll hire his own set of advisors. So he'll go out and hire his own financial advisory. He'll hire his own attorney and all that. And then, as a sell-side advisor, you need to get them the information. Well, and typically you do that in the form of a confidential information memorandum, which anybody that's doing M&A understands that. But So here's our sim in that case, and like I said, this was our presentation to the trustee and the financial advisor for this transaction. So I'm not going to go in depth, but it's typically, I'm sure, what you guys would do. I mean, we actually talk about the company's background and history, just like you're doing a valuation report. In fact, this came out of one of our previous valuation reports. So you do background and history. There's its service overview. So we went really in depth and made sure that the trustee understood what services this company was doing. A few pages on that. We talked, one of the key strengths of this company was its facilities. They had just moved into they'd taken a warehouse and remodeled it, and they had all this space, more space than they needed. And, but they had all this room for growth. And so there wasn't any physical capacity limitations on the growth of the company. And the facility was very well done. I mean, it's one of the nicer facilities I've been in. You know, everybody's got a window, or so, which in an old warehouse that was a challenge. But they really did it, and the morale there when you walked in, it was like, I mean, I wish I could build that type of morale in my company. I mean, everybody was very friendly. They said hi to you. They were fully engaged. I mean, they had a very high performing team, and they were doing a lot of things right. And a lot of it went back to the buildings. I mean, they saw, and you'll see in the well, you probably won't see it in the financial information, but you'll see the jump in productivity when they moved into the new facility. I mean, it was a direct correlation. Their billable percentage, their utilization percentage went up when they went into the new building. Part of that is they were now all under one roof, but they attributed a large part of that to the environment that they created there.
So there was actual efficiency gain with the new building design, but people and their attitudes actually improved.
Yeah.
Actually more motivated.
Yeah, you talked to the management team, and they said it's just incredible. Before, we were all crammed into this space, and everybody was on top of each other. Now everybody's got their own office. Everybody, I mean, you know, there's a lot of common areas. And we wanted to make sure we highlighted the building, so we had the little spiel there. Markets and customers. This was their top 10 customers, which we wanted to show them the stability of the customer base, because the top 10 customers for the last 10 years have been the same, even though they've grown dramatically during that time. This is their breakdown. I'm sure this is things you guys put in yours. We talked a little bit about the competition, the employees. Now the financial financial advisor, the trustee, is going to go out and do his own due diligence. We're just trying to guide him where we want to guide him. And I think I took the strengths and weaknesses. This is employees and management. Our management table goes on. We had a full organization chart in there, and the resumes of all 18 of our managers, because they're all key people with all employment contracts. So this is our financial analysis, our earnings adjustments that we made. So we're basically, without doing the valuation for the financial advisor, we're doing the valuation for him and saying, here's your adjusted earnings, here's your forecast. We gave him some guidance on here's the risk involved in the company, and so we're trying to steer him to our number, which we ended up getting our number, which nobody thought we were ever going to get. My partners, when they looked at the deal, because we have an internal review process, and I said, here's my sim, and here's what I'm taking to the trustees. And my senior partner, who has done many more deals of these than I have, looked at the deal and said, no way you're ever going to get that number. He said, you're not going to get it. He said, you need to set expectations right in your management or in the selling shareholder group that they aren't going to get $11 million. They're only going to get $9 million. And you're not going to get the IRRs that you're anticipating getting. He said, you just got, your deal's too rich. Well, there's our forecast. Then we did our benchmarking against industry data, which all we do is we color code it so that it's, this is something that the trustees told us they wanted. They said, we hate graphs, we hate charts, we need something that's easy to read and tells us what the hell's going on.
I like that, that's it.
And they said, can you color code it?
Yeah.
And we said, yeah. If it's above industry average, we'll make it green. If it's within a certain range of the industry average, we'll make it white. And if it's bad, we'll make it red. So you can look at that right there and tell me fairly quickly about the company's liquidity position and how it's changed over time. So, and we do that on all of them. CapEx, we actually did for the first time in the company's history, they did a capital expenditure budget. They'd never done that before. They just spent money whenever they needed to spend money. And we actually forced them to do it, which was provided along with this. And then working capital requirements, we led them to where we thought that should be with this table, obviously. So then we've given them all the due diligence. I took out the strengths and weaknesses because I couldn't present that without giving away who the company was or giving too much information on the company, so I took it out. But obviously their strengths was they had a very deep, strong management team. The building was a strength. They had 2 markets that they were in that they had virtually no competition, and so that was obviously a strength of the company. But so what we proposed was we were going to sell 100%, 2 parts, corporate redemption followed by the acquisition of the remaining outstanding shares by a newly formed ESOP. Let's see, we actually took some of the proceeds and we made a contribution to the ESOP. So that's how we got some of the cash because one of the things was we had all this tax. What they were doing previously is at the end of the year they would bonus out whatever the profits were. So this year we left the profits in, so we had this huge gain. Well, we had to offset that taxable income somehow, so we did an ESOP. We did a contribution to the ESOP we pre-funded the ESOP so that we could take the deduction in 2018. So we out of the 11 million that we ultimately sold for, we got 4 million in senior debt roughly. 2 million went to the contribution. 2 million went as a loan to the trust, and then the sellers carried back the 7 million. The transaction with the trust was 4 million. The redemption was 7 million. So we did the redemption first for the 7 million, and then we did the ESOP transaction for the remaining 4. And we funded that with the contribution, and yes.
I know this is going back a little bit, but with regard to the warrant, did you have to disclose
To who? To the trustee? Well, he had his own financial advisor. They were looking at that as well as we were. It came down. No, we didn't. I gave him the SIM and whatever was presented in there, but I didn't actually know. He knew he was playing blue sky. Obviously, because the book value of this company is only a couple $1 million, and we sold for 11 million. So. Well, the industry multiple was right shy of 6 at the time we sold. We got a little more than 6. But I'll talk about that real quickly. Then I want to keep going. But the reason we could get to the multiple, we got 7.3. The reason we got 7.3 was we entered into an agreement with the trustee where we guaranteed EBITDA levels. They were using EBITDA as the measure of cash flow, and they said, we're buying this EBITDA, we want to make sure we receive it. And we said, or they wanted to do a clawback, which is common when they think you got an aggressive forecast. Right. So they said, we're going to claw back. And I said, you're not clawing back. I said, we're not accepting a clawback. I said, the reason we can't do it on a clawback, I got 18 shareholders. They're each taking different percentages of cash. They're each taking different notes. I said, a clawback doesn't work here. And of course, I went to the shareholders and I said, you don't want a clawback because they're going to look at the first 2 years and then they're going to take, 7.3 times that, and they're going to take that back. So you don't want that. Let's guarantee them the EBITDA levels that we have in our forecast. And I said, the thing is, if you don't reach those EBITDA levels, if you didn't do the ESOP transactions and you didn't reach those EBITDA levels, you would reduce your compensation anyways. So you're just going to reduce your compensation down to the levels that you need to do in order to give them the EBITDAs that they want. What you're getting in exchange is you're getting 7.3 times that as a cash purchase price that's not going to get clawed back against. You do.
And capital gains and not ordinary income.
Yeah, all the good things that comes out of that. So,
Right.
so they said, and the trustee said, okay, we'll do that. We offered 2 years of guaranteed EBITDA for the purchase price. They wanted 5 years. We agreed on 3. So I'm like, so you basically have given back at the most 3 times whatever you miss it by, right? It's instead of 7.3 times what you miss it by. So I said, it's a win-win for you, and I couldn't believe it. I probably shouldn't be saying a lot of this stuff publicly, because
We'll charge for
if the financial advisor on the other side, but I think he did his job. I think in the end we ended up with a fair deal. I think it was favorable to us, but I wouldn't say it was overly favorable. It wasn't abusive.
It wasn't one-sided.
No, it wasn't, and and their financial advisor on the other side is a very well-known financial advisor that has a lot of respect in the community. So, but anyway, let's keep going on this. So, we estimated we would get 3.5 in senior debt. We ended up getting 4, so a little bit more. And then we estimated that we would get notes back with an interest rate of total return of 10.5 to 12. And we were going to take a 5.5% coupon rate. So our cash interest was going to be 5.5, and the difference between that and whatever our total return was going to be in the form of warrants. So that's the SIM. And then we had LIBOR plus 2.5, but it was that's how they priced it, but it was fixed. So I said, well, who cares what LIBOR is? I just need to know what LIBOR is at closing. It actually ended up being at a rate less than 5.5, but that's the senior piece. And the seller said, look, we're okay carrying this back even if we don't get interest on it, because we use that as a negotiating tool with the trustee's financial advisor to say, look, we're carrying this with no interest. We want a higher IRR on our warrants because we're giving it up on the front end. And he agreed. He said, yeah, you should be compensated for that. So we had gone in at 10.5 to 12, and if you look at what we ended up getting, my warrant analysis is down a few pages, but let's just keep going on this. So here's our forecasted EBITDA and sources and uses of cash. I'm not going to go through all this, but you just need to lay out what's going to happen post-transaction, make sure you know what your sources of cash are, you know how you're going to use that, and you've got enough cash flow there and debt service. This is what we had forecasted, yeah. And our forecasted is based on normal operations. I think it's an adjusted EBITDA because it's how we expect to operate going forward. But it's not adjusted to the fact that it doesn't take the transaction into consideration. Yes. Yes, yes. We ended up having one of the things, it's like any other transaction, you'll end up, well, maybe it's a little different because in a normal transaction, the seller just comes in and does whatever he wants with the board and everything. Here, we negotiated that they could have so many board seats. The board went from being 100% stakeholders to 60% non-stakeholders over a 3-year period. Basically, they were adding one outside board member a year. The term on the senior debt was 7 years. The term on the seller debt was 12 years. We actually got them. We got them to extend it 2 years, which if you know on the warrants you want a longer term because theoretically the cash value of the warrants becomes more because you get the advantage of that volatility for those extra 2 years, right? So you want a longer. I mean, we originally proposed 20 years, and they said they laughed, and I said, okay, let's get serious here. Okay, we'll go to 15, and they still laughed, and we won at 10, and they agreed at 12, and we said, we'll take 12. Sure, we'll take 12. Well, the thing is, they never are going to. It's never going to go to 12 years. If the company performs the way it should, they'll have the cash. Obviously we had to give them a call provision on the warrants. And it's exercisable no sooner than a certain date. But based on the cash flow, they could exercise that call very shortly after that date and take our senior debt out, which they fully expect to do. But even then, if you look at the IRR, we're still at about, well, we'll get to the IRR here in a little bit, but so sources and uses of cash, and then obviously our debt service coverage ratio right here, and you can see we actually are at 1.18 in one of the future years, which would put us out of their covenants, but the deal got struck this way. No, we knew we were out of covenant in that year, and I did. Their financial advisor had this same spreadsheet, or should have had similar spreadsheet, and he should have known we were out of covenant and had us correct it. But there's a couple other things going on. We did not build into our forecast right within 45 days of closing, and after the deal had basically been struck, they fell into this opportunity that was going to add fairly substantially to their bottom line, anyways, that came into the negotiations also. So we knew we were never going to be at 1.8 given the cash flow. Here's our warrant analysis. And this is just obviously the interest payments and the principal payments. Once we paid off the senior debt, we were free to do with the cash whatever we wanted to do. And management's intention was to make payments on the seller notes, even though the sellers didn't want the payments on the notes. So then now you've got management of the company, who are the shareholders, negotiating against the shareholders. So it becomes a pretty interesting dynamics when they're saying, no, I don't want payments on the notes, and the other part, but it's prudent for us to do so. Well, what's that? Oh yeah, let me go over here, and here's where we finally have enough cash to take out the senior debt. So our warrant kicker comes into play here. Now all this does down here is it just does a present value calculation, and all this, I mean, this tells you what your IRR are, and there's an IRR calculation. We use the one in Excel. That doesn't give, well, let's go out there and look. 11.3 is what Excel tells us our IRR was. But obviously, everybody knows IRR is a rate of return that makes your future cash flow is equal to what your outflow is right now. So if you look at this cash flow stream here, the actual IRR on this deal, that was the original outlay right there. In order to get to that number, it's 12.45. So our actual IRR on this deal is 12.45. We had gone in saying you can't expect somewhere between 10.5 and 12. We gave them, or they got 12.5. Now some of that was because of some of the things in the negotiations, but they still felt we got a pretty good deal on this. And that's when people started saying, well, if it's 12 and a half, I don't want the cash, I want the note. So, and there's also some interplay in here. Is we get quarterly payments on the notes as opposed to annual payments. And that's why you get the discrepancy between what Excel tells you and what you see here. So then we got to do the valuation. This is the future valuations of the company, and you normally use a static model there, so your multiplier is the same. Anyways, you walk through that, and here's your cumulative appreciation per share, which ultimately ends up being the price that you sell your warrants for. So, and we had negotiated. This was kind of when we were doing this. This was an earlier iteration. We agreed on 3,180 warrants, and then there was a change in the model after that, which should have reduced that number of warrants by about 20%. And I was able to convince the financial advisor that we're not changing that number. We could change other things, but we're not changing the number, because I've already communicated that, and he agreed. So we ended up getting the 3,180 warrants when it should have been to get our targeted. Typically, the reason that's in red, that's a critical number in ESOP deals. That's the warrants. That's the dilution from your warrants. And the Department of Labor right now, they look at that number very closely. If it's more than 20%, it's a red flag for them. And we were willing. The trustee said we're only going 20%. As it ended up, he ended up going 2.6%. We thought we were close enough that even if it gets challenged, they're not going to come in and challenge us over that small percentage. If that would have been 30%, we probably wouldn't have done the deal this way. We would have structured it a little bit differently. But obviously, your warrants is the last. You got to get everything else negotiated on the term sheet before you get to your warrant analysis. So, but the number there was like 2,600 shares as opposed to the 3,180 to make it 20%. But okay, here's your 404k deduction limits. That's just taking forecasted eligible compensation times your 404 limit of 25%, and then comparing that as to how your contribution levels look like, and we're fine. And as long as this line says, oops, I don't know where I'm at. Oh, there I am. As long as this says yes all the way across, I'm good. Yeah, I mean, you can see how skinny we were in year one. We had an $18,000 cushion. So, but one of the things we did is we hired the TPA to come in and they did all the work on that first year's analysis. We said, look, we got it as close as we can get it based on broad parameters. We need you to come in and make sure we're okay. They came in and said, yeah, you're okay, but you got some 415 limitations. And we said, well, yeah, we suspected we might have that. How do we fix that? Fix that for us. And they you just hand it off to them, and they fixed it for us. What else happened? Here's your loan amortization. We had a $2 million loan. That's the inside note. We did it over 20 years at 3.31% interest rate, which was the long-term AFR at that point in time. That's our annual payments. And then what this schedule just does is it just has a loan amortization schedule here that amortizes off the loan. Here's your shares that are held in suspense. Here's your allocation every year. So this is just telling you how many shares are allocated versus how many shares are not allocated. And then your benefit levels are your number of shares that are allocated during the year times the value per share, which we calculated up above. The 3.31. That was the long-term AFR at that point in time. Yes. Yep. Well, that was the long-term AFR as of probably October. I mean, I don't know that this model got updated to the final number, but we knew we were. The way the contract read was it was the long-term AFR as of December 31st. So whatever it was ended up being substituted in there. And oh, let's see. So here's the value of the stock that's being allocated every year. Here's the compensation, the eligible compensation. That's their percentage. And because we gave a lot of, we gave them a lot in year one, that's why you see some of the percentages in the first few years are less than that 4% that we were targeting. But when you look out long term, our benefit level's 3.8%, which everybody agreed was fine. Here's the shares allocated, cumulative value allocated, number of participants, the estimated number of participants, average balance per participant. So over time you can see how you're starting to give some decent benefit levels to the participants. One of the things they wanted us to do, typically don't do this, but the shareholder, because normally their accountant does this, but they wanted us to do an analysis of what the tax impact on the individual shareholders. So we, their basis in the stock, total basis was $650,000, and they sold for $11 million. So they had a very sizable gain on sale, but they could use the installment method, and so here's the value coming in less the basis times the tax rate and that. So they could actually do some planning, but the basis wasn't the same for each shareholder. So actually, one of the things that we gave them this, and they said, well, that's great. That's a 10,000 foot level, but we need this done for each shareholder. It's like, okay. So I had to spend a day in Chicago, going out and meeting with, well, first of all, getting all the data, running the analysis, and then meeting with each individual shareholder. What we ended up doing was we forecasted out their benefit levels, taking it into specifically your situation. So you're 43 years old, you want to retire at 63, or, well, let me do something a little. You're 57 years old, you want to retire at 63, you got a 6-year life. What does that 6 years look like, and what can I actually expect to receive from this ESOP? So that's the type of analysis we ended up doing for each of these individual shareholders. No, there were 18 shareholders. 18 shareholders, not the plan participants. We just had one. We had one meeting with the plan participants and said, "This is what this deal looks like," and they were. I mean, they didn't even know what we were talking about, to be quite frank. So, but we had to communicate what was going on with them. So that's the type of analysis we do in a transaction. I think most sell-side advisors are doing something very similar to this in an ESOP transaction. The one that made this somewhat unique was the fact that we had so many shareholders. We had a 1042 involved. We had people taking different levels of cash versus carrying back the seller paper. We had there was just a lot of part of it was structured as a redemption transaction and then a transaction with the ESOP. So there was a lot of moving pieces that went into this, but we got the deal done, and we got it done at the values that we told them, above the values that we told them they would get it done for. We had actually told them 10.8 to start with, and we got 11, and we told them they'd get 10.5 to 12% on the warrants. We ended up getting 12.5. So it was I started it when I did the valuation for the original founder 4 years ago. I did the valuation for the next gentleman 3 years ago. Actually, it was 5 years ago and 3 years ago, and then I spent 3 years going through this process with him. Yeah. So it. Yeah. Yeah. Founder number 2. He was the second name on the door. The guy that had the name on the door, the first name on the door was he had the larger share, and that's why the ESOP made a lot more sense for him. He ended up doing, he did a 1042 for the entire balance the entire balance, but we only gave him cash for 40% of it, and then he went out and did a seller. I'm losing my train of thought. He went out and did a structured note for it, and they levered it up and gave him the cash to complete the 1042 transaction. So it ended up working out. We had to spend quite a bit of time because obviously he was in a different situation than everybody else and all the other shareholders. We had to we had to spend some time making sure that everybody was being treated equally. These interest payments here, that the bank, the interest only payments. Oh, he did carry back some paper. Anyways, those interest only payments were going to him. So, Ron. Well, over the 4 years, yeah, I mean, what do you think it would be? Now, we did not take a success fee. My agreement with him was, I'm going to charge it for every, even if I'm thinking about it at night, I'm billing you for that time. But I said, but I'm not going to charge a success fee at the end. So I said, it's all dependent. Either you have enough confidence in me to get this deal closed, or if you want to do it on a success fee, here's my success fee. But I think I can get it done without the success fee. So that was my agreement with him. You're not too far off. You're a little bit high, but I should have charged him more. Is what I. Because if this deal was done by some of our competitors, this would have been an $800,000 engagement easily. Yeah. Because we you know, the other companies that are real active on the sales side out there, they end up hiring us to do the trustee work a lot of times, and so we get to see what they're charging, and it's like, yeah, but the company doesn't pay it. The selling shareholders pay it. Because the trust can't pay it, so the shareholders end up paying it, and in my case, my fees are paid by the company, you know, so a little bit different dynamic there. Yeah, well, I should have charged more, but it was I'd probably do a success fee. I mean, we talked about it. Obviously, I've got two of my other partners that do a lot more transaction work than I do. I mean, I only do, you know, a couple, 2-3 transactions a year. They're doing 10, 15 transactions a year. Bob does all our sell side work, and so I mean, this is usually his role, and I'm stepping into this. I haven't done a lot of sell side engagements before, so Bob oversaw the process, and in that process, you know, up front he said, you're not going to get 11 or 10.8, you're not going to get 10.8, and you're not going to get, if you get 10.5 to 12, it's going to be at the lower end of the range. So he says, go and set your expectations accordingly. So I met with management team and I told them, you're going to get 10-8 and you're going to get 12. And, you know, did exactly what opposite of what Bob told me to do. But, you know, we ended up getting it done. So company's ecstatic about it. Of course, we're only, what, 2 months into the year? So, well, we actually did. We ended up doing the discounted cash flow and working up our cost of capital, our capital, you know, our WACC that way, and we did not focus on what was happening in the transaction marketplace. Now we had seen some deals come through that were at this multiple or higher, so we know that there was transactions going on in the marketplace that could support our transaction if we ever got challenged. You know, there's so much complexity in this that there's a good chance this gets challenged, but that's okay. I mean, we're, you know, we had the financial advisor on the other side was, I could, if you guys probably wouldn't recognize his name, but if I said it at an ESOP association meeting, everybody would know who he is. I mean, he's headed up their valuation advisory committee in the past. That's how I first met him, in fact. And very thorough. One of the things we did on the forecast is, because he originally looked at it and said, it appears a little aggressive. So I said, well, I'm going to schedule time with you, and we're going to go through every single assumption in this forecast. No, we don't want to do that, but now we're going to do that. So it took us about 2 hours to go through the forecast, but I spent 2 hours going through the forecast, basically line by line, and saying, here's our assumptions. Whether you agree with them or not, here's our assumptions so that you have full disclosure. I gave him my spreadsheet and said, or the company spreadsheet, and said, here's the detail that they went through to do this. I mean, they went through they looked at professional dues for each employee and forecasted out what they were going to be in the future. I mean, they went to that level of detail. So it was pretty hard to challenge and say, you know, this forecast is not supportable. I mean, we looked at the the revenue side is always the questionable side, but they've been hiring every year. They hire eight interns, and they end up usually hiring somewhere between 3 to 7 of those interns. And we said, okay, they're gonna hire 4 interns. 4 of those interns are going to convert to full-time people going forward. That's the only growth we threw into the forecast. Anyways, it ended up being a nice engagement. I wanted to do it this way to show you the actual workings of it. I hope it was helpful. If it wasn't, any questions?
So when you did that, the subtraction with debt, was that based on the sale price or the existing debt before the conversion?
It's existing debt, but there was no existing debt. They were debt free.
No, okay.
Well, that's not totally true. They had to take out a very small line of credit to pay the taxes from the previous year, because they had bonused everything out, and then they and then they
typical.
You know, they thought they had bonused everything out and set their taxable income to 0, and then when the CPAs got it and actually did the calculations, there was a tax due, and they didn't have any cash, or they didn't have enough cash.
So what you're saying, they forgot to tax the bonus that they were paying the original tax on?
Well, however, it was a book tax difference, because they were. One of the things was, the other thing that came into this is they had a built-in gain, because they had book tax differences. Where is that in here? So we had to account for that. The trustee advisor wanted a dollar for dollar reduction in purchase price for those capital gains taxes that the corporation would have to pay in the future based on that, recognizing that taxable income. And you can spread it out over 4 years. So we said, well, you're not gonna pay that $1.1 million in 1 year. You're gonna pay it over 4 years. So what's present value of the 4 years? And we just said, well, let's just throw it into the adjustment to the cash flow stream. So that's how we did it, is we threw it in as this adjustment to the cash flow stream, and which lowered our value accordingly, but not dollar for dollar, right? Because
More equitable.
it was more equitable to everyone that way.
Sure, but as a follow-up, if I saw correctly, you worked out invested capital, would it be counterintuitive to even, if you didn't have any debt, why would you use an invested capital cash flow? Because that would mean you should be doing a WAC.
We did.
A WAC is not,
We did a WAC.
but it's useless if you don't have any debt.
No, that's not true. I mean, the whole theory about this is what would a third-party buyer, how would they structure the transaction? And a third-party buyer in this case would go out and do exactly what our trust did. They would go out and they would obtain a debt, not as high a percentage as what we ended up getting, but there's going to be debt in the capital structure. If you look at the engineering industry and you look at what their capital structure is, it's about 25 to 30% of their capital structure is debt, and that's permanent financing that they carry from year to year to year.
Okay.
So we ended up using, I believe, 25%. I don't remember what the exact percentage of debt was, but we put some debt into the capital structure in calculating our WAC.
Okay.
And then we used, obviously, debt-free cash flow. Yeah, it's a market participant. Yep.